So again, as a little recap, you are looking for a trend line that presents itself in a very obvious fashion, containing at least 2 points, ideally wicks. Much more ideal to have a wick here and a wick here, right? You have that, all is fine, all is well. And then what you're looking for is a close below the trend line. Once you get a close below that trend line, you're watching for a structure change, right? Once you get that structure change in your favor, you can then target the low like this and a low like this. So maybe it produces another wick here and then it comes up higher. This is the candle that closed. So then you could go ahead and look at it this way instead. Connect those 2 points and do the same thing all over again. Maybe it comes down and it wicks again. So perhaps it wicks a little bit lower that time. Okay, no problem. We just change our trend line over and we do the same thing again. Obviously, you're changing your structure points. So if you're looking for that absolute confirmation, the absolute confirmation would be losing this guy here. Can you still short the confirmation of coming into a trend line of liquidity like this, or the high peak rather, producing that shift in structure like such, entering say here and entering on like that 1 minute supply zone that we did before? You can, but remember, structure is still pointing up here, even if there is a trend line of liquidity. Because it's still pointing up, we have to see more, right? So ideally, this would be a primary target because you have to be reasonable with your target if you're watching this internal pull. And we'll use different colors here. We'll say this is the purple internal pull from the low up towards the high of the hump. We'll call these humps. We'll call this hump 1, 2, 3, and 4. So the high of hump 4, you had a transition in 1 minute structure. Whereas this is a 15-minute liquidity trend line, we'll call it. Makes sense to look at it on the 15. You entered here. You put your stop above that high. That's fine. Absolutely fine. But remember, doesn't mean you're coming all the way down to here. You need to see the next point of the trend line break with a close. So this guy breaks with a close, and we're more than likely coming down to here. Although there is no for sure in this game. So let's say we have a downwards trend line, and we're looking for a move up towards the liquidity objective right here. Okay, and this is the trend line itself. All right, so we have dollar signs here. We have dollar signs here. So we'll say X marks the spot of the trend line. So should price come down very bearishly, like such, all red candles, not giving you a chance even on the 1 minute time frame to see a structured transition like this. We're not that lucky right now. Then guess what? You had no choice but to wait for a high like this to be reclaimed unless you want to go with a riskier entry. Maybe it's sufficient enough for you based on other confirmations to wait for this low to be reclaimed. Perhaps you only wicked out that low and you didn't quite close below it and it looks like that instead. You could base this on structure itself and say that this became a weak high because it failed to take out the low that created it, which was this low. But it is more riskier to use that approach. You're not guaranteed to hit this high. So that's something you have to remember. There is no guarantee regardless, but the probabilities aren't stacked in your favor that you're going to come up to this high. Maybe this high, but not necessarily this high. You have to wait for this high to break. So let's look at a couple more examples before we wrap this up. Just go to the 2 hour on Bitcoin and we'll see what we have. And of course, you'll find this across many smaller time frames, but sometimes you'll see ones that you don't hit the entire target. Maybe, again, there was a reason why. So this was clearly one. You had a uptrend one where this was the liquidity trend line. Ultimately, you broke that trend line. Now, of course, because this did not go lower, I can't use this point and this point. That doesn't work. I need to base this on what other people are seeing as a valid support line. So I have 2 points together, and ultimately it broke through bearishly right here. When it broke through bearishly, there could have been people that longed in that area, right? So remember that there was probably longs here trying to limit order where they estimated the trend line to hold. And perhaps by the time it broke structure, which unfortunately in this case would have been all the way down to here, under the trend line itself, even though it broke structure here, it broke under the trend line here, which means that you're more than likely to hit here. Sure enough, if you had entered on a lower time frame, you probably could have refined your entry and use this as your liquidity target. I do it all the time and it works damn good. That much I will say. You can also apply, hey, if you break that trend line using that theory that we talked about earlier, that, hey, maybe there are a bunch of trap longs in here. If that's the case and they have a chance to exit at break even after being underwater for a couple of days, will they take that opportunity? I wonder. Well, let's see. What if we drew like a box around where we think they entered? Oh, look at that. But it's nothing but an inefficiency. Yeah, but it's an inefficiency that has a meaning behind it. People thought there was going to be a bounce here. They market long. They limit long to find out that they were suffering underwater deep sea exploration for the last 3 days. So price finally gives them a chance to exit at break even. Shorts open in placement of their longs. 1 for 1. Down you go, adding to the selling pressure. So there's an excellent example right there if I've ever seen one. We also have an example of a liquidity trend line from top down here. So we would have used these 2 points. And this is one that I would say did not work very well. Why didn't it work very well? Well, let's see. So you have a point here. I'm going to use that point here, right? Very solid points. In fact, you could have started it like this, and then you could have drawn that down. As price reclaimed, it clearly didn't break anything, so you would have had to move it over to here. Price did not reclaim the lower high, yet it made another lower high with another significant lower low, then you would have moved it over to here. And then it never crossed the trend line again until way down here. That's when it crossed the trend line next. Now, unfortunately, this is the second tap of the trend line. You could have said, well, we reclaimed that trend line, and technically this is valid enough for me to go long on, but the second tap of the trend line is still way up here. This is definitely a trickier one. Now, you could have still built the bias. So, if you had seen this break, you could have said to yourself, well, if we get a retest, as long as it still makes sense by the time we get the retest, we can try along. But in this case here, look at what happened by the time it came back down. The other trend line prevailed. So you have conflicting trend lines here. That makes it a little bit tougher. It's not going to be a perfect scenario every single time. You're going to run into these situations where you have these conflicting answers, and you'll have to look at lower time frame structure. That's all there is to it. Maybe not the 2 hour, maybe go to the 15, perhaps the 10, perhaps the 5. Until you can find a reasonable time frame to make the local structure move on, or entry on, and exit on, then leave it, right? Don't touch it until you see something in your favor. So if your bias is, hey, I think we're taking this high, and structure's going up, down, up, down, up, down, all fine and dandy, and you're like, oh, well, this is an order block right here. Broke structure here. So why not wait for price to come back in that order block? Well, okay, that's fine. You can do that. Was there an entry in the order block, though? Well, if this is your order block, I think not. What about the 5? Well, we can't go back that far in time. But because it went through so aggressively, I would say, you know what? Chances are it probably did not have a market structure change.